So I'd like to talk today about affirmative action. And I'm going to talk about affirmative action from a perspective that I think is pretty different from the perspective from which most discussions of affirmative action tend to take place. I'll be talking from the point of view of an epistemologist. My background is not in ethics, it's not in political philosophy, it's in epistemology. I'm really interested in what do we know, how do we know, how do we make good decisions about what to believe. And I think there's an interesting epistemological upshot to some of the issues that are raised in affirmative action. So that's what I'll be talking about. Probably everybody's familiar with at least the basic idea of affirmative action. Usually if you start a talk, you start by kind of defining some things. So I will do that, although I actually have some reservations about just how we might want to characterize the notion of affirmative action. I'll explain that sort of as I lay out some of the substance of what I want to talk about. But here's one kind of statement of the sort of thing that you might think affirmative action is. This is a statement from Louis Hoyman. Affirmative action is preferential treatment discriminating in favor of members of underrepresented groups, which have been treated unjustly in the past, and against, he's obviously partisan in this debate, but against innocent people is the way that Hoyman describes it. Now, like I mentioned, I have some reservations about how exactly we want to define the notion of affirmative action, and I'm not sure in the end I'm going to want to accept this characterization, but I hope that at least a lot of the paradigms of affirmative action policies are clear enough, and we'll be able to talk about them. And I will be arguing in defense of many of these kinds of policies. It's hard to define things. I'm not going to worry too much about them, although I will come back at the end of the talk to a question about whether what I'm describing really ought to be described as affirmative action or not. So here are some examples of kinds of policies that are, I think, reasonably naturally recognizable as affirmative action styles of policies. And I've listed these in order of sort of increasing controversiality. So imagine that people tend to be prejudiced against members of a certain group. I'll mostly be talking about two groups in the talk. I mean, in theory, you can talk about affirmative action toward pretty much any kind of, any class of individuals. But a lot of the literature has had to do with women and ethnic minorities, in particular black people. So those are the two examples I'll come back to over and over again. But in principle, what I say here can apply in lots and lots of cases. So one thing you might do, and you could consider this to be a relatively mild affirmative action policy, if you're making a decision, you could have the policy of not discriminating against, say, black people, or not discriminating against women. And if I'm setting the policy for my organization, I can tell people, when you make your decisions, make sure you don't discriminate against various groups. That's a very mild kind of policy, but it might count as affirmative action. Another sort of thing you can do that's relatively mild is you can make a point in your recruiting, I want to make sure that I get lots of women applicants for my job, so I have enough, good candidates to choose from. That's another fairly mild kind of policy you might do, although you could argue this constitutes some kind of preferential treatment in some respect. Getting into more contentious territory, you might consider group status, that is to say, consider the fact that, say, an applicant is a woman or a black person as a plus when you're making your decision. So it's not the only thing, it's not an overriding consideration, but if I'm looking at a lot of applicants, maybe I make special note of the black people, I make special note of the women, and I consider that to be some reason to choose those applicants rather than others. This obviously is getting into fairly controversial territory. And very controversially, you might have things like quotas. So you might have the policy sort of starting out. You could say, I'm doing admissions for my university, and I have a policy even before I look at the applicants. I'm going to make sure that 15% of my entering class are black. You could have that policy. Actually, you can't really in this country. That's illegal. But that's an example of an affirmative action sort of policy. Standard kinds of arguments, and again, I'm just going to present this in order to contrast what I want to talk about. But a lot of the literature about affirmative action so far has been broadly in the realm of morality. So you see things like, there are all these kind of past injustices against, say, black people. Black people have been systematically discriminated against, and so we need to compensate in their favor in order to make up for those past injustices. That's an argument. Judith Jarvis Thomson had an influential paper in the 70s making this kind of a case. You might think that some of the more forceful kinds of affirmative action policies is really the only way to do the more restricted thing. Not really my topic now. I don't want to go into that. This is the motivation behind some of the Supreme Court decisions, especially relatively early in this sort of history. A lot of the current action legally seems to be focused on to what degree there's a legitimate interest in having diversity in your group. So again, if you're hiring, maybe you don't just want to hire the best individual. Part of the consideration is you want to have an appropriate mix. You want to have enough women on your faculty. You want to have enough black people in your student body. These are the kinds of considerations that are often advanced in favor of affirmative action. Like I said, a lot of the current debate is focused around these kinds of areas. Arguments against these kinds of considerations. So if you're thinking about compensation for past injustice, well, maybe you think, look, the injustices were in the past, and it's not these very individuals that are now being advantaged, and as the Hoyman sort of definition suggested, and now you're discriminating against people other than the ones who committed those injustices in the past. That doesn't seem fair. It's an argument against a lot of this stuff. A kind of slogan form of the same consideration. Look, maybe there was injustice in the past, but the solution to that's not more injustice now. This is a kind of justice-based argument. And more broadly, people are concerned about affirmative action on grounds of meritocracy. So there's this nice plausible principle, you should get the best person, maybe for moral reasons, or maybe because you're looking for someone who's going to do the best job here. And if you're choosing for reasons other than who's the best, then you're not furthering that aim. This is where a lot of the literature is. Again, this is very impressionistic. I'm going through this quickly, but I take it that this slide really characterizes a lot of the current debate about affirmative action. What I want to say has nothing to do with anything on this slide. What I want to do, Hoyman's a good example of a person who's argued a lot of those common arguments. What I want to do is argue the following. I want to argue that actually considerations about who deserves what, about meritocracy, just finding the best person, a lot of these will favor policies that are recognizably affirmative action policies. I think for pretty much that reason, that affirmative action is defensible for reasons that are wholly independent of morality. Again, I'm not an ethicist. I'm not going to say anything about what's fair or who deserves what. I'm an epistemologist. And I think there's an epistemological basis for a lot of affirmative action policies. And an interesting upshot of what I'm going to say is that actually affirmative action has nothing to do with underrepresentation. So the arguments that I'm going to give in favor of affirmative action are going to apply whether or not the relevant group is underrepresented. If, for whatever reason, your faculty is already 90% female, I'm going to give an argument that you should still, in some sense, give preferential treatment toward hiring women. The same goes for other groups, of course. So this is what I'm going to try to get. This might sound surprising. I hope it does, but I think that I can make a good case for these claims. Just to be a little bit more concrete, I have two examples of the kinds of policies that I think are defensible. Suppose that I'm hiring a philosopher. My philosophy department is hiring, and I've gotten a whole bunch of job applicants, and we've narrowed it down to two. Jack and Jill are clearly the best two candidates. And as I look closely at these files, I've studied them, I've read all the writing samples, letters of recommendation, etc. It now seems to me that Jack is a slightly better candidate than Jill. I think Jack will probably do a better job, but it's a pretty close call. That's the situation. I think there's a good case to be made that under these kinds of circumstances, I ought to hire Jill. And I think this is so on purely meritocratic grounds. I think this is so for reasons having nothing to do with who deserves what. That's another way of saying it's purely meritocratic grounds. And I think this is so regardless of how many women we already have in our department. Again, I'm just advertising what I'm going to argue. I don't expect this to be plausible yet, but I'm going to try and get us there. Second case. And I think I can make this argument whether or not there's a legitimate interest in having diversity in the faculty. I guess that's already clear given what I said in that third point. Here's the second case. Suppose that I'm grading student essays. I'm grading student essays. Jack and Jill are two of my students. They've both written pretty good essays, but they're not great. As I look at them, my first instinct is give them both a B. I think there's a case to be made. Maybe I should give Jill a B+, but keep Jack's grade as a B. I think this might well be true, given all the same kinds of restrictions mentioned before. Not on justice grounds, pure meritocracy, etc. This is where I'm going to try to get us. So how might I get us there? Let's first set aside questions about affirmative action, and just think about the case of visual illusions. So I expect lots of you are familiar with cases like this. So you look at a figure like this, and you ask the question, which of these figures on, whoa, what did I do? There, okay. There, that's what I meant. Which of these two figures is taller? There's your question. And as you may know, when you have kind of lines on a two-dimensional field that sort of force a kind of perspective like this, we tend to get it wrong. So if you're like most people, when you look at this figure, the person on the left side, or no, you're right, the person on the right side looks taller than the person on the left. This is a visual illusion. And you can prove it. I've added some grid lines there, and if you remove the things, you can see comparing to the grids, you can see these two figures are actually the very same size. So this is a situation where, given the background, we tend to underestimate figures in certain kinds of positions on our perspective. So what's the lesson? Here I take it as the lesson from visual illusion, and then I'm going to apply this to the case of affirmative action. So we as humans and our perceptual faculties, we have a visual bias in favor of figures nearer to the convergent end of lines in cases like that. So if you get a case like that, don't trust your initial judgment. Instead, what you should do is, if it's a close call, you should try and counterbalance that bias. So you should say to yourself something like this. Well, look, the guy on the right kind of looks bigger to me, but I know, because I'm aware of the psychological research around here, I know that I'm biased in cases like this. So I'm going to guess that the left guy's actually taller. Maybe I'll guess that they're really just equal, even though the right one looks taller. This is the kind of reasoning that I think is pretty obviously rational in a case like this. And I take it it's pretty obvious that these kinds of considerations have nothing to do with ethics or who deserves what or anything. This is a purely psychological and epistemological matter. If you're trying to do the best job you can identifying which figure is taller, you should counteract this bias that you know you have in cases like this. So here's my suggestion. Cases of certain kinds of groups, and again I'm talking most specifically about women and black people, although one can consider these kinds of questions in lots of other cases as well, are like that. We have a systematic bias, I'll suggest, toward the under-evaluation of, for example, women. So look at these two figures. Which one do you think is taller? Well, the man probably looks taller to you than the woman. Actually, that's a mistake. And actually, in this case, you can see it's not just equal. Actually, the woman is taller than the man in reality. But because of the visual bias we have, we tend to get that wrong. So if you look at a case like this and are just trying to guess which one's taller, you should probably guess the woman's taller. If it looks like a kind of close call, you know these lines are likely to bias you in favor of the woman. So you should say to yourself, yeah, the man looks taller, but that's probably wrong. Probably the woman's really taller. That's the way to get the right result in this case. So here I take it as a conditional that should be pretty plausible given what I just said. If it's true that our opinions tend to be biased against members of a various group, then that gives us reason to try to counterbalance that bias. And the way you can do that is by sort of boosting your final assessment of members of that group. Just like if you're looking at two figures on a board, if you know you're biased against figures that are closer to the less convergent parts of the lines, if it looks close, you should boost your judgment of those people, in this case on the left of the slide. So this is our conditional. I think we're here. I think you should accept this conditional now. What I will now do is present some fairly familiar, some fairly well-recognized psychological data in favor of the antecedent of this conditional. There's lots and lots of evidence that the antecedent of the conditional is true. Even among people who are not sort of explicitly prejudiced against people who espouse generally egalitarian attitudes, implicit bias is still a real thing. So happily, overtly sexist, racist attitudes are less common than maybe they were. I mean, that's not to say they're not gone. That's still real too. But even among people who say all the right things and you think of as generally decent, unprejudiced people, these implicit biases are still there. And I'll give you evidence of that in a minute. One question you might wonder, are you blameworthy for having these kinds of implicit biases? Is it a moral failing that you tend to underestimate women, that you tend to underestimate black people? I don't know. think that's a really interesting question. There's an interesting literature about it, but again, I'm not an ethicist, I'm not going to try and talk about that question. The antecedent of my conditional is just, we have these kinds of biases. And if we do, then I think the consequence is true, and we have epistemic reason to boost our assessment of group members. So here's one sort of thing that provides evidence in favor of implicit bias. This is a well-recognized kind of test. If you Google implicit association test, you can take lots of these tests yourselves. You might be surprised by the results. Really interesting stuff. But here's the kind of test that occurs. If you get a list like this, so here's a list that contains some words that have to do with being either male or female, like grandpa and wife, and some words that have to do with being either sort of sciencey or sort of humanities, like biology and English. Here's a task that you might have to do with a whole bunch of words like this, sort of into two groups. Sort them into one group where it's either a male word or a science word, and sort them into another group where it's either a female word or a humanities word. That's one kind of task. Group the male words and the science words together, and the female words and the humanities words together. That's a task you could have. That task, it turns out, is a lot easier than this task that you might think should be just the same. Group them into either male or humanities in one group, or female or science in the other group. So group the female words along with science words, and the same on the other side. This task is much harder. People are slower at it. People make more mistakes at it. You're probably like this. Get online and take some of these tests. It's really eye-opening to go through this kind of an exercise. You get the same kinds of things with racial bias. So here's another example that's out there in the literature. These are sort of stereotypically black names and stereotypically white names. And we have sort of positive and negative adjectives. And it's a lot easier, it turns out, for most people to group the black names along with the bad adjectives than to group the black names along with the good adjectives. This is just a psychological fact. And it turns out that this kind of difference does not correlate at all well with anything like self-reported attitudes about sexism or racism. This is something that occurs even among people who have these generally liberal kinds of views. And this also correlates with various other kinds of implicit biases, like the ones I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. Again, there's tons of literature here. I'm just going to mention a couple of things to give you an idea of how this all goes. It's a really, really interesting experiment. There have been a bunch of things like this, but here's an example of one. Experimenters sent in resumes in response to job ads, and the resumes were all identical except for one thing. They used different names. Some of the resumes had sort of white-sounding names. Emily and Greg were the examples in the study, and some of them had black-sounding names. Lakeisha and Jamal were the names used in the study. And the white-sounding names did a lot better. Identical resumes, but the employers wanted to hire the people with the white-sounding names. And this is true even if you're an equal opportunity employer. That makes no difference if you've listed that in the ad. This is just an implicit bias. Nobody's saying, the employer's just sitting down here saying, I want to hire a white person, not a black person. But just at this sort of precognitive level, there's a very strong effect that's going on here. Same thing happens for gender. This is a really interesting study just from last year, and this one's interesting that it happened on university professors in the sciences. So we've got again, made-up applicants, resumes for laboratory management positions in university science departments. So the experimenters pretend to be a student and say, hey, I'm a student, I'm interested in biology, I'm planning on applying to grad school, I would like to apply for this position that's been advertised. Again, identical resumes, different names. In this case, the names are John and Jennifer that are used. Turns out the scientists are much more likely to hire the John than the Jennifer. And not just they're more likely to hire him, they're asked to evaluate how hireable is this person, how competent do you think this person is based on the resume, how willing would you be to offer mentorship opportunities to this person. These university professors also have this kind of bias. They're much more inclined to rate John highly in these cases. Interestingly, they rate Jennifer as more likable, but they want to hire John much more. Again, these are absolutely identical resumes and everything except the name. And here's, in my mind, one of the most shocking bits of it. John is also offered a significantly higher starting salary than Jennifer is. Again, absolutely identical resumes. Only difference is in the name, and of course, when you see the different name, attached to it. Okay. Lots and lots of research like this. I won't belabor it right now, but you know, if you start looking at these studies, there's just tons of it. And again, these are university professors. These aren't sort of uneducated people. So again, here's this conditional. This is a conditional that I suggested a little while ago ought to be like, very uncontroversial right now. If there are systematic biases against certain kinds of members, and I'm talking in particular about women and black people, then that gives us a reason, an epistemic reason. If we're just trying to make the best choice, hire the best person, identify the best person, that gives us a reason to boost our assessment of individuals that we tend to be biased against. Okay, let me just come back very briefly to the question of what exactly affirmative action might amount to, and what we should think of as preferential treatment. There's a sense in which, there's a sense in which this might not be considered preferential treatment, because you're just, after all, you're trying to counterbalance this bias that you already have. Nevertheless, I think that the considerations that I've been pressing do support surprising claims like this one. If, like I was talking about before, I'm trying to hire a philosopher, and Jack looks slightly better, only a little bit better, I think I should conclude, actually, Jill's probably the best candidate, because it seems to me that Jack's only slightly better, and I know that I'm very likely to be biased against women. So probably, if I'm really making the best decision just about who the best person is, it's probably Jill, not Jack. And if I'm looking at my students, if I'm assessing their essays, the same thing might well go. If they look the same to me, if I'm probably biased against women, then I should give Jill the better grade. Now, of course, there are other kinds of options in lots of cases. I'm not saying this is the only thing to do. If there are other ways to eliminate the bias by like grading blind, that's often going to be a better policy. These have costs. You have to consider these one by one. So is this really a defense of affirmative action after all? Well, I'm not really sure. I mean, you know, we can fuss about labels. What do you have to be an affirmative action policy? Do you really have to care about something other than merit? But I do think that the kinds of considerations I'm having here do give you reason to adopt what look like paradigmatic affirmative action style policies, and that's the thing that I'm really interested in. So lots and lots of the time when you look at this literature, you get these thought experiments, and you start out by stipulating the candidates are equal in every respect except for their race or except for their gender. My main point is, you can't just help yourself to that. Because when you're out in the real world, you don't have as a given fact that they're equal in every candidate except for gender. You have to use your cognitive abilities to recognize which candidates are better or worse. And we're not that good at that. And I'm giving some advice for doing a better job there. So, moral of the story. Just like there's no such thing as perspective blind assessment. You know, you can't just say, everything else equal, they look the same if you just ignore the lines. You can't tell what they look like if you just ignore the lines. In just the same way, there's not really such a thing as gender blind assessment or race blind assessment. It's a mistake to pretend that there is, and it's a mistake that has epistemic consequences. That is to say, it's a mistake that's going to make you worse at getting the right answer here. So we shouldn't make that mistake. We shouldn't pretend that we're able to look objectively and bias-free about these kinds of considerations. That is the moral of my story. So thanks very much.